Hi, everyone. So my presentation today is titled Scattered Archives, the Philippine Exhibit, and Igorrote Village at AYPE 1909. This presentation is related specifically to the research that I had undertaken under the UW Library's Southeast Asian archival fellowship, which was funded by the Luce Foundation and sponsored through the University of Washington's Southeast Asian Studies Center. So the focus of my presentation today and really the focus of my research at the University of Washington was specifically on the archives relating to the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition. These archives are really scattered throughout Seattle and are found at the Special Collections in Suzzallo Library at the University of Washington, the Museum of History and Industry, or MOHI for short, the Wing Luke Museum, the Burke Museum, the Seattle Municipal Archives, and the Seattle Public Library. In addition, archives pertaining to this exposition are found at the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland, and at the Smithsonian and Library of Congress at Washington, D.C. While there are several repositories for understanding the more general history of the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific in Seattle and in DC, we only really see several specific archives in Seattle that contain or repositories that contain archives relating specifically to the Philippine Exhibit and the Igorrote Village at AYPE. This includes the special collections at the University of Washington, the Museum of History and Industry, and the Burke Museum. In addition to that, we can expand this archive to include the experiences post AYPE and how AYPE had an effect specifically on this process of local Filipino-American experiences. So in looking at how the exposition is remembered, we actually can expand the archives to include the Filipino-American National Historical Society, as well as the Filipino-American community in Seattle, who are sites and repositories and of this process of remembering how the exposition was continuously remembered, experienced, and felt post 1909, and how it affected the Filipino immigration and migration experience into the region. So this presentation will consider how archives become the repositories of memory and experiencing both the exposition both in the past and the present, and how access to archives have an effect specifically on this. So yeah, before we begin, I do want to provide some general historical background on AYPE in large, and then focus more specifically on the Philippine Exhibit and the Igorrote Village. So really, before beginning the discussion of remembering and experiencing the exposition in relation to the Philippine Exhibit and Igorrote Village, we need to think about the United States participation and history of exposition. So the United States has had a long history of participating in organizing international expositions, beginning first with the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Fair, which is chronicled in Robert Rydell's work on expositions and the United States participation in organization. So we start off there. So the AYPE is part of this long history of organizing fairs in the United States. Anyways, the AYPE was first conceived after the Lewis and Clark Exposition held in Portland, Oregon in 1905. It was first conceived by Seattle businessmen associated with the Alaska Club. And really the initial proposal for the exposition was to focus specifically on Alaska, the indigenous communities there, as well as its natural resources. And in May 8th, 1906, the businessmen associated with the Alaska Club formed the Alaska-Yukon Exposition Corporation. However, it was soon expanded in order to benefit the commercial interests in the Northwest by including Pacific markets and the centrality of Seattle in trade with the United States colonies in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, as well as its northern territories, So by May 31st, 1906, the word Pacific was added, changing the name to the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition Corporation. As noted in John Edward Chilberg's recounting of the who was the president of AYPE, his recounting of the organization and management of the exposition in 1958, the justification for adding Pacific was, quote, because of the importance of the Oriental business in Seattle, we added Pacific to our corporation title. In addition to various other businessmen, Edmund Meany, my apologies, of a University of Washington professor, heavily promoted the importance of an exposition in Seattle. For Meany and the Board of Trustees at the University of Washington, an exposition would expand the space and opportunity to grow the university's campus. And so the AYPE was located on the ground, the University of Washington campus, and opened on June 1st, 1909, closing on October 16th. Through the relationship established between AYPE and the University of Washington through Edmund Meany, AYPE transferred 7 fair buildings to the university to house laboratories and lecture halls, as well as the expansion of what is essentially the expansion of the collection associated with what is now known as the Burke Museum. In addition to collaborating with the University of Washington, the AYPE Corporation also worked with politicians within the state to secure federal funding. Through the support of Richard Ballinger, the mayor of Seattle and later United States Secretary of the Interior, as well as William Taft, who became president during the year of the AYPE and was previously the Governor General of the Philippines from 1901 to 1903, and then the Secretary of War from 1904 to 1908. The support of these politicians are evident in the appeals before Congress for additional funding for this exposition, highlighting the centrality of this exposition in understanding the United States expansionist policies within North America, the Pacific, and Asia. This was highlighted in the hearings before the Committee on Industrial Arts and Expositions for AYPE held on January 27th, 1908. This hearing included statements from various representatives and governmental officials who highlighted the significance of this exposition to the economic welfare of Seattle, as well as its significance in promoting the materials, flora, fauna, and labor that can be extracted from America's colonies and brought into the Seattle port. In the statements, representatives such as W.E. Hermberg makes note that these expositions not only educated the public on resources available to them from the colonies, but also provided a space to highlight the civilizational mission of the colonial government. In addition, we also see in Taft's testimony that we actually have there is a significant role placed on the Department of War in the construction and collecting of these exhibits related to the Philippines. Furthermore, these archives found in the special collections, as well as in the Burke Museum, provide an understanding of how the Philippine collections in the United States were developed during the early 20th century throughout museums in the United States, as evident in early Philippine collections, which I will discuss a bit more in depth later. But essentially in Taft's remarks, he points to the fact that the Department of War is in the business of expositions and is in the business of displaying non-Christian groups within the United States, from the Philippines within the United States. So the AYPE itself had various places for exhibiting the Philippines. There was the Philippine Exhibit, which was curated by the Department of War. In addition, there were displays related to the Philippines found in the Smithsonian's traveling exhibit, which was used at various expositions following the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition, which entailed a massive collecting project that would really build the beginning of the collections related to the Philippines at the Smithsonian and the National History Museum in New York. Furthermore, there were exhibits of stuffed animals, figures, books, photographs, and photographs found throughout government buildings at the center of the exhibition. In addition to the government-funded exhibits, the Igorrote Village was run and operated by a private business. In 1905, the Filipino Exhibition Company was formed by Edmund Felder and Richard Schneidwind. This touring company consisted of 2 troops of Bontoc men, women, and children that toured the United States, Canada, and Europe, performing for exhibitions such as the Lewis and Clark Exposition in Portland, at amusement parks such as Schutz Park in Los Angeles and states parks throughout the United States. The performers moved from venue to venue and carried what became the standard props associated with their performances, such as gongs and shields, swords, baskets, looms, and textiles. These shows really highlighted the collecting practices of the state and private collectors. In addition to that, through AYPE and even before, we actually see the beginnings of the standardization of the motif of the Igorrote as savage and how it becomes commercialized by private citizens for the benefit for an entertainment value. So we do see a separation in terms of what becomes seen as the popular vision of Philippine savagery as seen through the traveling Igorrote Village versus how the United States government wanted to perceive its civilizational process through the establishment of these exhibition spaces that tend to recall neoclassical architectural styles and pull specifically from the exhibition language emerging in the United States to present and discuss indigenous groups in North America. So this AYPE becomes a very central space in understanding and processing the writing of Philippine history. So what we do see in the archives, in the special collection archives relating specifically to AYPE, is that there is this constant echoing between various materials. For example, in Edmund Meany's papers, we actually see his notes in this process of writing a book specifically on the diplomatic history of Hawaii, Samoa, and the Philippines. And it actively mirrors the Smithsonian's traveling exhibit that focused specifically on the Philippines, Hawaii, and Samoa. So essentially, what we have with regards to this is this fact that the Smithsonian is actually, through its exhibition space and through its traveling exhibition space that moved throughout the United States, is actively informing how history is written and how academics during the early 20th century interpret history. So so we're seeing that this is essentially creating the format for the process of writing diplomatic history and essentially writing or conceiving of how history should be written or perceived. So in addition to how these exhibition spaces were informing the process of writing history and therefore the process of really conceiving and expanding and proliferating Philippine history, we actually see the proliferation of a different type of archive, which is the visual archive. One of the most well-known and well-used archives related to AYPE in general, and more specifically to the Philippine Exhibit and the Igorrote Village, are the Frank Noel collections found at the University of Washington and at the Museum of History and Industry. These photographs taken by Noel were continuously reproduced in books, articles, newspapers, and even postcards, and are still continuously proliferated today through the online databases associated with the Noel photographs from special collections at the University of Washington and at MOHI. These photographs are often used to provide a visual context to the historical analysis of AYPE. But what's particularly interesting is the way that these archives are scattered or collected. What becomes missing is really a discussion of the breakdown of the collections in relation to the subject matter. So the photographs on the Igorrote Village found at special collections are predominantly of the exhibition space associated with the Philippine Exhibit. And what we see with regards to both the special collections and MOHI is that they have multiple images specifically of the exterior space of the Philippine collection. But when we turn to the Igorrote Village and the photographs associated with the Igorrote Village, we actually do see a shift in terms of the focus of the collections. And yeah, so what we see is that, interestingly, the photographs, while the collection of the Noel collection at the University of Washington is fairly large and very significant, and what we have is the fact that a lot of the photographs pertaining to the Igorrote Village at the University of Washington predominantly focus on the male bontok performers. While there are photographs of women, they often fade into the background. The central focus is predominantly on the performances of headhunting, of dancing, that were very male-centric within the Igorrote Village. In contrast, the Museum of History and Industry's collection of Noel photographs, while significantly smaller, focus predominantly on women, and it places women at the center. Places women at the center of these photographs. So we see a lot of photographs of women at work, weaving, creating clay pots, focusing specifically on the labor of women. While they are, and it also focuses on their awareness of the camera. These photographs at MOHI tend to have women looking directly at the camera, posing, whereas the Noel photographs of the men found at the special collections at the University of Washington tend to show them in action, tend to show them ignoring the camera and moving and performing. So it's an interesting contrast. And what becomes particularly interesting is that fact that while women were present at, bontok women were present at all of these various traveling Igorrote villages, the photographs of the men become really the central focus of understanding experience. And these are the photographs that are predominantly disseminated, both online and in academic publications. So it creates these uneven experiences and an uneven understanding of who the people were at these in these exposition spaces and what kind of duties they entailed. In addition to that, the photographs also provide a space for understanding the process of collecting and really the basis of collecting it within the context of American museum institutions. So what we have here is a photograph found at the special collections with an object found in the Burke Museum. So here on the Burke Museum database, we actually see information pertaining to a spear that is labeled as Igorrote and was donated by a specific individual. All of these individuals who are donating these items are named. The person who created it is not. What becomes particularly interesting is that you see this form actually evident here, carried by various individuals who include Chilberg, photographed here, wearing a basket hat from the Philippines and carrying what appears as part of the spear, surrounded by other men, presumably associated with AYPE. In addition to that, we also see other men wearing bahags or loincloths, meant to mimic or imitate what they're seeing on the pastry or what they're seeing in association with the Igorrote village. So these items, while they're meant to evoke another culture, an other culture, or a primitive culture, in quotations, these objects, when you look at them in relation to items that are actually from the culture, or from Bontoc culture, these spears were never used. These spears do not speak to the aesthetics of a spear that is used in Bontoc for the purposes of ritual, for the purposes of warfare, for the purposes of protection. So these items are being created specifically to be able to be presented. A lot of in the context of Bontoc, as well as other Cordilleran groups in the Philippines, spears such as this wouldn't have this kind of decoration. In addition to that, it is a very short spear. It has no, these prongs have no function. If you look closely, even just the way that the metal is, or the iron is tanged, is incorrect. It is meant specifically for an American market to signify otherness, or a Philippine form of otherness that could be easily recognized through its form and through the aesthetics. But this is something that never existed or would not exist aesthetically or practically within the context of what is now known as Mountain Province. So we can see that there is a communication that needs to happen between these various collections as the object is informing what can be known about the image, and the image is informing more of what can be known about the object at the Burke Museum. So this issue with inaccuracy, or not inaccuracy, but maybe trickery, is evident in other items that are found at the Burke Museum, wherein we see a lot of scaled replicas of items that didn't ever really have a use within the context of Bontoc society. So for example, what we have here is an axe replica. Once this axe replica itself is used specifically to be looked at. If you actually look at the form, and if you look closely, this axe is not properly, the iron of the axe is not properly placed within the wooden shaft. You can also see the fact that its edges are incorrect. They're too flat. So what we're seeing is this creation of replicas of what could be a reality. So what we have with the Burke Museum collection is the fact that the primary collection is based specifically on items that were collected to be presented and to be exhibited as representative of Cordilleran or Bontoc culture. And then we also have the process of creating objects specifically for an American market, as we see with these two figures that were sold to the Burke in 1910 by Mrs. J.M.T. Partello. these two objects are meant to evoke bulul, but they are not bulul. They are meant to evoke them through the pairing of them. They're meant to be invoked through this idea of the painted wood that is meant to be representative of patina associated with bulul. So what we see is this idea of creating objects that are that do not have the same social, cultural, economic, political identities found in the Cordillera, but are meant for outside consumption. And this is evident through various items that are found at the Burke Museum. And in a way, they raise questions as to what they're meant to do after the fair, after they're collected. So they become more or less, these items become sites of memory and changing memories pertaining to these objects and the new communities that develop within Seattle, more specifically, and how individuals are connecting to these items. So with that, I wanted to move specifically to this idea of memory and memorialization of AYPE in relation to the archives. So we actually do see the fact that there is this continuous remembrance. We can see this with the publication of this booklet here, which was published in the 1980s and is a continuous memory specifically of that showcases the centrality of the Igorrote Village in remembering AYPE. In addition to that, we also have a letter that is found at Mohi that was responding to a Seattle Post-Intelligencer article on AYPE in 1981. In this letter, she notes, quote, "I was very surprised when I read your article in the Saturday PI with a picture of the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific. They mentioned first the Igorrote tribes of the Philippines. My mother and father, with another couple, spent a week in a hotel in Seattle while attending the exposition. They bought a beautiful Igorrote spear from the tribe, which my mother gave to my daughter and son-in-law, who have the spear on a brick wall in their rec room. My folks were very fascinated in the tribe." So we see that in this letter, it provides us with an understanding that there's a continuous feeding loop happening between these performers and the Americans who are going to experience this Igorrote village. So what we see is that these Bontoc performers are feeding into essentially American ideas or demands to see Philippine primitivity due to the fact that they are making money off of these shows. And essentially it feeds into this desire to see, which in turn feeds into this desire to pay to see. So there's this feeding loop that's not just informing the constant movement of these Igorrote villages, which in turn ended up at AYPE, but also it informs what these performers are creating specifically to be sold to individuals who would in turn sell them or donate them to museums. So this process of remembering and memory and memorialization becomes central to understanding a lot of these early 20th century items and objects and artworks that end up in museums such as the Burke and at Mohi as well. But there's a different type of memory and memorialization that also is happening, and it is happening within the Phil-Am community. So what we see is the fact that at the within the Phil-Am community, there is this different process of memory that's happening. So we have the reinterpretation happening within the Filipino-American community, specifically of the items at the Burke. Here we have the two objects, two sculptures, which I've pointed to as never really necessarily belonging to this concept of bulul, which become labeled as Ifugao ritual deities within a pamphlet that is associated with an exhibition that was part of the Seattle Folklife Festival in 1996. In addition to that, we also have the reinterpretation or reconfiguration of the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition 100 years later, at the 100-year anniversary in 2009, where we have Bebop coming in and creating a space that essentially allows for them to choose how they wanted to represent themselves. And it becomes them interpreting specifically a new Igorrote Village to be displayed during the centennial celebration of AYPE. In addition to that, we also have the fact that these Igorrote villages, the Philippine Exhibit, becoming really a core memory in the Philippine American community in Seattle. In my discussion with Dorothy Cordova from Funds, she spoke to me specifically about her memories as a child growing up in Seattle to a mother who migrated from the Philippines to the United States. And she pointed to the fact that when her mother first arrived in Seattle, she went to a store, and one of the store clerks asked to see her tail. This is a this directly parallels with this idea that Cordillerans or Igorrotes had tails because of the loincloth they were wearing. Another memory that she shared with me was in the 1930s. She remembers having the police called on her family because one of her neighbors, who was a white man, called the police and claimed that her family stole their dog and ate it. Again, this is related to this really one of the stereotypes that emerges with these Igorrote villages, which was the dog feast. And we see a lot of references to the dog feast or dog feasts in archives relating to the Igorrote village and AYPE, as well as newspaper articles from 1909. And it becomes what's ironic is that they found the dog in their neighbor's basement. He was essentially trying to get them out of his neighborhood. But these kind of core memories of various types of stereotypes that come to the forefront in early experiences that come from the 1930s earlier and even after, are related specifically to what was experienced, what was remembered at the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition, and what is continuously presented within the various archives and their online repositories. Thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.